We're starting chapter 46 this week, and we're starting at verse 1. That's Ezekiel chapter 46 and verse 1. Just a quick recap. If you remember last week, we were talking about the feasts in the temple, and God was laying down the regulations for the sacrifices for the different feasts. And that's how the chapter ended. As we will see, this chapter is changing tack again. And I'm going to read just the first 3 verses to start off with. This is what the sovereign Lord says. The gate of the inner court facing east is to be shut on the 6 working days. But on the Sabbath day and on the day of the new moon, it is to be opened. The prince is to enter from the outside through the portico of the gateway and stand by the gatepost. The priests are to sacrifice his burnt offering and his fellowship offerings. He is to worship at the threshold of the gateway and then go out. But the gate will not be shut until evening. On the Sabbaths and new moons, the people of the land are to worship in the presence of the Lord at the entrance to that gateway. Okay, to start this chapter, the pulpit commentary says this. This chapter falls into 3 divisions. The first gives supplementary directions for the prince and the people of the land when engaged in solemn acts of worship. The second furnishes the prince with instructions as to how he may dispose of his portion or inheritance. The third adds particulars about the sacrificial kitchens for the priests and for the people. The supplementary directions contained in these verses relate to the worship of the prince and the people on Sabbaths and new moons and at appointed feasts generally. Now, once again, this chapter opens with the phrase, "This is what the sovereign Lord says." Once again, this is meant to emphasize not only the importance of what Ezekiel is about to say, but the fact that it's not him that's saying it. These words are coming from Yahweh, not from Ezekiel, and he wants the people to understand that. Don't forget, Ezekiel was a priest. It would have been all too easy for the people to accuse him of making things up to suit his own ends and the way he thought the temple ought to be run. And so he's at pains to make sure right from the start that the people know this is what the Lord says. And he's about to talk further on the temple, the people who work there, and the worship that goes on there. He's anxious, as I just said, to make sure the people know that this is God speaking. And why wouldn't he? The last thing he'd want, I would imagine, is for people to accuse him of making all this up to suit his own ends. And we all know what people are like. So when we talk about the prince is to enter from the outside through the gate and stand by the gatepost, where the priests will sacrifice his burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. He's to worship at the threshold of the gate and then leave. Once again, I would suggest that we need to go away and study diagrams of the temple, if you like, to make any sense of this. Because we can talk about him going in through the portico and standing by the post and not going by the threshold, but most of the time for us it's just going to go and not mean an awful lot. Matthew Henry makes this observation. But it should rather seem that he did not go through the gate, as the glory of the Lord had done, though it was open, but he went by way of the porch of the gate, stood by the post of the gate, and worshipped at the threshold of the gate, where he had a full view of the priest's performances at the altar, and signified his concurrence in them, for himself and for the people of the land that stood behind him at the door of the gate. And regarding this gate, Ellicott states that it has already been provided that the outer gate on the east should be kept closed except for the prince. The same thing is now commanded for the east gate of the inner court also. And further, the days are specified, the Sabbaths and new moons on which it is to be used by the prince. Yahweh also goes on to say, however, that on the Sabbaths and new moons, the people are also be allowed to worship at the gateway, but not to go in. Feinberg says this: since Israel's calendar was a lunar one, the new moon had significance for them, whereas it probably hasn't for us today. Moreover, the feasts were reckoned in relation to the phases of the moon. Some people are persuaded that this vision of Ezekiel's new temple is symbolic of the Christian age, post-crucifixion, but Feinberg goes on to address this also when he says, the emphasis here is unmistakably on the Sabbath and the new moon, which alone should indicate the Jewish setting of this passage, and that we are not here on any Christian or New Testament ground. We can't get away from it, can we? Arguing, squabbling over what it means. We just can't help ourselves. I'd like to say as long as it keeps some people happy, but I don't think it does. Okay, I'm going to read verses 4 to 8. The burnt offerings the prince brings to the Lord on the Sabbath day is to be 6 male lambs and a ram, all without defect. The grain offering given with the ram is to be an ephah, and the grain offering with the lambs is to be as much as he pleases, along with a hin of oil for each ephah. On the day of the new moon, he is to offer a young bull, 6 lambs and a ram, all without defect. He is to provide as a grain offering 1 ephah with the bull, 1 ephah with the ram, and with the lambs as much as he wants to give, along with a hin of oil with each ephah. When the prince enters, he is to go in through the portico of the gateway, and he is to come out the same way. Okay, there's not a lot we can say about these few verses, except that it specifies what the prince must bring for the offerings. Dr. Constable says this: on the Sabbath days, the prince's burnt offerings would consist of 6 lambs and a ram without blemish. Grain offerings were to accompany them, an ephah with the ram, as much as he was able to provide with the lambs. He was also to give a hin of oil with each ephah of grain. This is a variation of what the Mosaic law prescribed. These grain and oil offerings evidently symbolize the Lord's rich provisions for his people. In addition, on the day of the full moon, he is to offer a young bull as well as the 6 lambs and the ram. And Yahweh also reiterates once again here that he's to go in through the portico of the gate and go back out the same way. In other words, he's not to properly enter the temple through that gate. Yahweh's being very specific here about this temple. Excuse me. About the regulations and about the offerings. And the more we read through it, the more we can see there are differences between the original rules and regulations given in Leviticus and these that are given now concerning this new temple. I'm not going to go into the reasons for the differences because I don't think it's important for us to know that. But I'll let the experts argue about that if they want to. Just take it for face value that this is talking about a different period. We're not meant to be talking about Herod's temple or anybody else's temple. This is a new temple that is going to be appearing in the millennium period. Okay, let's look at verses 9 and 10. I'm sorry we're going through this a bit quick, but there's not a lot you can talk about it, really. When the people of the Lord come before the Lord at the appointed feasts, whoever enters by the north gate to worship is to go out by the south gate, and whoever enters by the south gate is to go out by the north gate. No one is to return through the gate by which he entered, but each is to go out by the opposite gate. The prince is to be among them, going in when they go in, and going out when they go out. So now we've got a rule, which probably wasn't in the original ones in Leviticus. The people are to go out from the opposite end of the temple from which they arrive. Seems a strange instruction on the face of it, or it did to me anyway. And the exact reason for this can only be guessed at. And again, I would suggest it's probably not important for us to lose any sleep over. But suggestions have been made, basically two suggestions. And the first one is this provides for an orderly flow of coming out of worshippers and going in and coming out. And surely it goes on to say that we serve a God who's an orderly God. A God who likes order and chaos. Otherwise, you're going to get people going in and coming out and going in and coming out, and people, barging into him on the way out and what have you. So it provides for an orderly flow. The second reason that's been suggested is perhaps that it, in some manner, the intention was to maintain a sacred decorum in his holy house. It's difficult to recognize and maintain this sense of holiness when all around you is chaos. When everybody's going, excuse me, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to bump into you. Oh, excuse me, can you get out of the way? Holiness goes out the window. You're concentrating on not treading on people's toes, not banging into people. But doing it this way, it's been suggested there's a sense of orderliness. People can come in that way, quietly concentrating on the holiness of God and go out that way without disturbing anybody. It keeps a sense of calmness and a sense of focus on God's presence. And God's presence has always been important. It's always been strong. Don't forget, all throughout Scripture, men and women have fallen on their faces when they've encountered God, when they've recognized the presence of the Almighty. But perhaps the best explanation is the third one. It's, to my mind, the most striking and perhaps the simplest. The symbolism of it is easily understood. It's got nothing to do with passageways for entry or exits. It's simply this: never leave the Lord's house the same way you enter it. Calmness and order helps to foster a mindset of faith and a mindset of expectation that you will personally meet with a holy God who supernaturally interacts with us in spirit and mind. So in other words, when you come in, you could apply that for us, say, go in through there, go out through there. But basically what we're saying is you come into God's presence, you should never leave the same way. You should be different. And I think that is the most striking explanation, perhaps, of why people were told to go in there and go out. It's maintaining a sense of calmness. It's helping people to recognize God's holy presence and to concentrate on it. And it enables us to come out of there different from when we left. Exactly. Never look back. And the lesson there for us is every time we go into the Lord's house, we should come in quietly and reverently, but expectantly, so that by his love and power and grace, we will go out filled with joy and peace. And that's especially true today, going off track a little bit, because there's so many people got so many problems. You should be able to come in through that door, concentrate on God's presence, and when you go out that way, leave it all here, because that's what Jesus tells us to do. Cast all your burdens on me. Notice, however, that you can only go in by the north and the south gates and not the east. And the reason for that is because there's no gate opposite the east gate. There's one north and south, but there's no gate opposite the east. Another striking thing is the prince is to be among them, offering and worshipping. Now, I'm not too au fait with the way things went on back in Leviticus, but I can't imagine the kings of Israel mixing with the people and worshipping. They would have had their own little spot with the people behind them. But here the prince is encouraged to be amongst the people, worshipping them. Wearsby says this: the prince will not isolate himself from the people on the feast days, but will be part of the crowd. Again, perhaps this is intended to foster this unity that Pastor is always on about amongst God's people, because unity is important. Even right from the leadership, right the way down, you get in this sense of unity if the prince is among the people when they're worshipping. Yeah. But those of you who are observant may have picked up on the fact that there seems to be a contradiction here. Because at the beginning of the chapter we read that the prince is to enter by the east gate. The prince is allowed this privilege, usually reserved for the priests, of entering by the east gate, which will be opened for him, and he's to leave the same way. And yet in verse 10 we read that he's to be amongst the people. Now Ellicott provides us with an answer. On occasion of these yearly feasts, it was no longer necessary that the priest should represent the people, they being themselves present. He therefore now worships in their midst, entering with them at the north or south gate and going out by the opposite one. So in other words, on the times that he's going in through the gate, he's there to represent the people because they're outside behind him. But on these occasions where he's not needed to represent the people, he's to be amongst them and with them. He goes on to say the difference concerns free will offerings, which the prince shall make whenever he desires, and the other concerns the yearly feasts. So we're not talking about all the feasts here. We're talking about separate feasts on occasions where the prince is to be there on his own, on occasions where he's to be mixing with the people. Alexander says, if the prince desired to make a free will offering, of a burnt offering, of consecration, or a fellowship offering by thanksgiving, the east gate was to be specifically open for this act of worship and then closed when he's finished. Again, I would imagine this probably made a lot more sense to Ezekiel's people than it probably does to us. But we have to look at this and get the big picture out of it and not concentrate on too much of the details. Like we just said about coming in through the gates and leaving your presence. That's what we've got to concentrate on. There's a message for us. We've just got to look for it. Okay. Okay, let's read verses 11 to 15. At the festivals and appointed feasts, the grain offering is to be an ephah with a bull, an ephah with a ram, and with the lambs as much as one pleases, along with a hin of oil for each ephah. When the prince provides a free will offering to the Lord, whether a burnt offering or a fellowship offering, the gate facing east is to be opened for him. He shall offer his burnt offering or his fellowship offerings as he does on the Sabbath day, then he shall go out, and after he has gone out, the gate will be shut. Every day you are to provide a year-old lamb without defect for a burnt offering to the Lord. Morning by morning you shall provide it. You are also to provide with it, morning by morning, a grain offering, consisting of 1/6 of an ephah, with 1/3 of a hin of oil to moisten the flour. The presenting of this grain offering to the Lord is a lasting ordinance. So the lamb and the grain offering and the oil shall be provided morning by morning for a regular burnt offering. So verse 11 reiterates what was stated earlier on in the chapter concerning the meat offerings. It gives the same list of things that you need to provide. Verse 12 reiterates what shall be done for the prince when he desires to make this free will offering. In other words, the gate will be open for him and then closed after he's gone. Verses 13, 14, and 15 contain regulations for the daily sacrifices. This is basically the same as under the Mosaic law, but instead of being offered every morning and evening, here it is provided only for the morning. On the other hand, the accompanying to the meat offering is increased from a tenth to a sixth of flour, and from a fourth to a third of a hin of oil. Again, subtle differences, but I don't think we need to be too concerned about them, to be honest. Okay, verses 16 to 18. This is what the sovereign Lord says. If the prince makes a gift from his inheritance to one of his sons, it will also belong to his descendants. It is to be their property by inheritance. If, however, he makes a gift from his inheritance to one of his servants, the servant may keep it until the year of freedom, then it will revert to the prince. His inheritance belongs to his sons only. It is theirs. The prince must not take any of the inheritance of the people, driving them off their property. He is to give his sons their inheritance out of his own property, so that none of my people will be separated from his property. Okay, so we've switched tacks again now. And we're on the subject of inheritance. And the first thing we should notice here is that the prince is said to have sons. And this immediately disproves the theory that some people have put forward that the prince is Jesus. Because if the prince has got sons, how can it be Jesus? We also, through these verses, get a hint of the past behavior of Israel's rulers when we read in verse 18 that the prince must not take any of the inheritance of the people. Remember, Yahweh had Ezekiel prophesy against Israel rulers for this very reason back in chapter 34, because they've been guilty of taking property off God's people, of spoiling them, robbing them of their inheritance. And here, the prince is specifically forbidden to do it. This is why, no doubt, the prince, Israel's leader, has been given a generous allocation of land next to the temple. Because if he's got this generous allocation of his own, he doesn't need to take it off anybody else. We also see in these verses a hint of the old Levitical rule of the year of Jubilee, where he says any property that he gives to his servant is only theirs until the year of Jubilee. Now, if you don't know about this, the year of Jubilee was the year at the end of 7 cycles, and according to biblical regulations, it had a special impact on the ownership and management in the land of Israel. However, some experts point out that although the biblical rules concerning sabbatical years are still observed by many religious Jews in Israel, the regulations for the Jubilee year have not been observed for many centuries. They say that according to the post-exile rabbinic interpretation of the Torah, observance of Jubilee only applied when the Jewish people lived in the land of Israel according to their tribes. Thus, with the exile of the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, about 600 BC, the Jubilee has not been applicable. So they say. But here we see that that rule is clearly in force. And if you like, that can be taken as another indication that God's people are back in the promised land again. If they say this rule doesn't apply because God's people are no longer living in their land, and now we see it being applied again, that's an indication that God's people are going to be back in their promised land. These verses also indicate that this new temple will be in the millennium period of history because it hints at many Jubilee years and many generations of the prince's descendants. And so the bottom line is, as far as the prince or the ruler of Israel is concerned here, he's being told, you've been given a generous allotment of land, be happy with it. Don't try and get more by taking from God's people what is not yours. Be content with what I am giving you. And he's also instructed to maintain that this land of his, must be in his family as their inheritance from generation to generation. So God is being very specific here about inheritances in the land. But then that's no surprise, because if you go back to Leviticus, he was quite fussy about inheritance back in those days as well. So that's one thing that is not changing. Let's look from verses 19 to 24. Then the men brought me through the entrance at the side of the gate to the sacred rooms facing north, which belonged to the priests, and showed me a place at the western end. He said to me, "This is the place where the priests will cook the guilt offering and the sin offering, and bake the grain offering, to avoid bringing them into the outer court and consecrating the people." He then brought me to the outer court and led me round to its four corners, and I saw in each corner another court. In the four corners of the outer court were enclosed courts, 40 cubits long, 30 cubits wide. Each of the courts in the four corners was the same size. Around the inside of each of the four courts was a ledge of stone, with places for fire built all around under the ledge. He said to me, "These are the kitchens where those who minister at the temple will cook the sacrifices of the people." So these final few verses of the chapter are concerned with cooking the sacrifices, the guilt offerings, the sin offerings and the grain offerings, and the sacrifices of the people. And here Ezekiel's guide is back again. We last heard of him at the start of chapter 44, where he took Ezekiel to the north gate in front of the temple, where he saw the glory of the Lord come in and fill the temple. What a sight that must have been. What a sight that must have been. It's likely that his guide never went anywhere at all, even though he's not mentioned. It's likely he was still by Ezekiel's side all the time through chapters 44, 45, and 46. And now, recognizing that Yahweh has finished talking to Ezekiel for now, he takes him by means of a private passage to the kitchens of the priests, where they will cook the guilt offerings, the sin offerings, and bake the grain offerings. Jamieson Fawcett Brown Bible Commentary says, "Due regard is to be had for the sanctity of the officiating priest's food by cooking courts being provided close to their chambers. One set of apartments for cooking was to be at the corners of the inner court, reserved for the flesh of the sin offerings, to be eaten only by the priests whose prerequisite it was, before coming forth to mingle once again with the people. Following that, he is taken to the outer court, where there are 4 kitchens, one in each corner of the outer court. And these are the kitchens where those who minister at the temple will cook the sacrifices of the people." David Guzik says this, "There were specific places for the preparation of the sacrificial meals associated with the sacrifices of the people. The sacrificial meals were an important part of the offerings made, an act of fellowship not only among men, but also symbolically between God and man." And Wouter on Hop, "This feature of Israelite worship shows how concretely the people expressed their belief that God has made provision for the most basic of bodily needs, the need for food. It also symbolizes the union between God and Israel. The worship that went on in the temple was not confined to words and gestures. It included the eating and the experience of fellowship that comes from sharing a meal." And speaking again of these outer courts, Jamieson Fawcett Brown says, "Another set at the corners of the outer court for cooking the flesh of the peace offering, of which the people partook along with the priests. All this implies that no longer are the common and unclean to be confounded with the sacred and the divine, but that in even the least things, as eating and drinking, glory to God is to be the aim." It's a celebration of God's provision. And let's be honest, most of us know personally God's provision because we've all been blessed in some way or another. You know, if we're brutally honest about it, we're blessed by the fact that we've got somewhere to live. We've got somewhere, water on tap. We can walk to a supermarket and buy any kind of food we want to at any time. We can even order food and get it delivered to us. By some parts of the world standards, that is blessed. Amen. Okay, that is the end of that chapter. And I think I'll finish it early because I don't want to get halfway through another chapter and confuse us again. Or more importantly, confuse me.